This is Signal and Noise, bringing clarity to the chaos of modern marketing.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Signal and Noise. This is episode 2, which we're calling Agentic AI and the Future of SaaS, or as Rio Longanchor, my co-host, likes to say, is AI the death of SaaS? Or thematically, I think you said, Rio, something like did TV kill the radio star, which you might be dating yourself with that statement. Do you remember when that video first aired on MTV?
That was their first one, right? I think that was 81, something like that.
Yeah, it was like shortly after they put the sort of MTV flag in that video
Flag on the moon.
On the moon, and that video was the first. It was one of the first music videos I ever saw. But I think it's a really interesting topic. We've got Ben Wilde, who's the head of innovation at Georgian. And for those of you that don't know who Georgian is, they're a VC that invests in growth stage AI and automation-focused B2B software companies.
It's a great discussion. I mean, I think everyone's going to be so excited to listen to this.
Yeah, it's a great discussion that you quickly can get into almost beyond your depth, but I think it was a really 360 view of every aspect of agentic AI and how it's impacting, in very realistic terms, the effect that it's happening today on people's jobs, on the advertising ecosystem, on larger industries in general. So I was thrilled by the conversation.
You see people posting all the time, is AI going to kill SaaS? Obviously that's being a little hyperbolic potentially, but it definitely is going to change it. So it's a great discussion. Stay tuned for that. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah. And so before we get into that, we're going to do our kind of news rundown. Right now, I think it's pretty important to cover the topics of economic uncertainty. Obviously, the upfronts and new fronts, which Rio will take you through some of his observations of the biggest news coming out of those over the last 2 weeks with the IAB new fronts and then the upfronts last week. I watched some of them, was able to get some streaming links. There's a lot of entertainment, but also a lot of ad tech, martech, and advertising talk during these, at least the preambles, that you didn't typically hear at upfront. So it was a pretty interesting experience. But before that, I think it would behoove us not to talk about the fact that the marketing ecosystem, as our CEO Matt Krepsik says, is about to get weird, right? So there's certainly some economic cycles that we've experienced over the last few years. Rio and I have been around for more time than we care to admit in the industry. And what we've noticed is that every economic cycle in the advertising industry specifically represents a good opportunity to evolve. And so, just to get an idea of where we are now, I did a little bit of research and we've seen some various percentages in terms of the likelihood of a recession. JP Morgan is saying 60% even this morning. In 2025, Goldman Sachs says there's about a 45% chance of recession. The New York Fed, via Forbes, suggests a 30% chance of recession over the course of the year. So we don't know exactly yet. It seems like things are stabilizing. But I think overall, we're expecting in Media Radar and in a lot of the research that I've done, and I know Rio has done a lot of this research as well, there's going to be an impact on advertising. I mean, marketers are expecting a 6 to 10% cut in advertising spend. We expect that SMBs are going to be more exposed to volatility, which is generally the case. There's likely to be structural shifts in the advertising market, right? You look at the Google breakup, you look at what potentially is going to happen with Meta. So there's a lot going on in the ecosystem right now that might leave some of us a bit unsettled. But I think, if you look at what happened with COVID and Brexit in the UK and what happened in the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis in the US, you'll see some room for optimism, I think. And Rio, tell me if you disagree. Initial ad spend in the UK during Brexit and the COVID era, sort of 2019, remained pretty strong post-COVID. It was up 8%. It eventually fell to low single digits. But what they did see, and I think we saw this in the US as well, is a tremendous shift to digital, right? So I was in the digital ecosystem in the digital advertising world. So are you, Rio. Both of our businesses, Slalom Consulting, Newstar, saw significant boons from the COVID period, which I don't think we expected.
Yeah, that was interesting, Brett. So I remember, I was working management consulting during the 08, 09 financial crisis. It was catastrophic. There were immediate, across the board, 40% cuts throughout the industry, and teams that focused on financial services had up to 60% headcount reductions. It was brutal. And it was immediate. Then we expected, when COVID hit, we expected the same thing. Everyone was creating lists of people. It was really sad, right? And it felt like the world was ending. But then the opposite happened. Business took off. We grew headcount by over 50% during that year, like that's starting, let's say July, when we realized the world wasn't going to end. We realized, okay, there's more money going into digital. I was hiring 4 people a week at some points, but losing 2 because they were being poached by Adobe, Salesforce, other consultancies. But it was a wild time, and
which is pretty astonishing if you think about it. I mean, during that period when you were going into supermarkets with gloves on and masks on, and nobody knew what was happening, you were Cloroxing your produce, for God's sake, and you're hiring 4 people a week.
That was incredible. Yeah, without meeting them. I mean, we never, like, the thought of hiring someone without meeting them pre-COVID was almost unimaginable. Why? No way you do that. You want to sit down in a room with them, or at least have someone do that. But the fact that we weren't doing that, we were hiring such high volume. It wasn't just us, it was everyone, right? I mean, all the tech companies, all the hyperscalers were, certainly all the consultancies, and really anyone in digital. So so to your point, Brett, we don't know what's going to happen, but short term, ad spend is definitely, looks like it's down. Marketers are being told to clip their budgets. I'm seeing that. Big expenditures are being delayed or deferred or canceled altogether. That's already starting. And the way this works too is there's always a short-term freak out, but the impact really is going to be next year, right? Because next year the new budgets get made this fall. So I guess it'll depend on how this year ends. But next year, I mean, that's usually what happens. Next year is when you see the budget really get clipped.
Yeah. Yeah, in 2007, 2008, certainly there was a decline, I think a 14% decline in U.S. ad spend during that period, right? But there was a structural shift, another digital advertising structural shift. And this year, digital advertising is going to surpass 80% share of total ad spend for the first time ever.
It's crazy.
Which is remarkable. And part of that was driven by that economic cycle. The other things that kind of happened in that period, which were pretty interesting. One, obviously, the sort of decline, continuous decline of local TV, newspapers, radio, right? Largely taken over by the digital ecosystem. Search and social saw steady growth. YouTube introduced their ads in 2007. That may not have happened at that time had there not been an economic cycle like this, right? Hulu introduced ads in 2009, right? Which is really the advent of CTV as we know it today. And I know with the upfronts and the new fronts, and Rio's got a full analysis on that, CTV is a big play in a number of respects. And it was a big part of the conversations that I was listening to. They're saying it's going to account for all growth in television advertising going forward, which is a remarkable shift if you look back just 5-7 years ago in the ecosystem.
There's going to be 20 billion this year. It's going to be around that will be the estimated CTV spend. I mean, it's not quite as big as either individually cable or broadcast, but it's bigger than each individually. It's not as big as them combined, right? So it's not just big as linear, but linear is gradually declining. You look at cable subscriptions, I think they're falling. I think I read it was 6% a quarter, something crazy like that. So over time, it's definitely it's not going to go to zero, but it's going in that direction. And yet spend on CTV is rising very dramatically. So yeah, not surprisingly, to your point, Brett, that was one of the main discussions. That and ad tech, right? It's interesting too. Like ad tech's kind of eating the world, right? You look at upfronts and new fronts. I mean, 5-6 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly was maybe an afterthought, but now is all the discussions, which we'll go into in a moment, really were centered on different tech advances that were being rolled out.
And I think I read a report from Activate Consulting recently that said by 2028 they're expecting 128% growth in streaming televisions, streaming television households specifically. So from 60 to 77 million, and there's been a 78% decline, or there's going to be a 78% decline in broadcast households. So the shift to almost entirely digital from a media and advertising ecosystem perspective is definitely underway, and it was certainly a big topic at the upfronts. Last week. Well,
and not surprisingly too, looking at both of those, like performance television, performance TV, and shoppable streaming, shoppable content. That was a big focus of it. Not surprising. If we are in the outcomes era, right? I don't think there's any debate anymore, right? Tying views to conversions, tying it to commerce is going to become more and more important, right? So in that vein, couple things to call out. Netflix unveiled its AI generated seamless ad format. And this is cool. So you kind of think of like a can of Coke, like floating within a title card, right? Brands will be able to do this. It's a really cool advertising, I think, breakthrough that's now being enabled by technology. I had a good conversation with Triple of CRO at Dinner Share a couple of weeks ago, and like even Triple, if they're rolling out this content formats where you can actually insert logos at a frame level within creative, it's really cool within streaming content. So this is going to become really the norm. We're going to have product placement kind of taken at a micro level here. I think CTV is enabling a lot of that. Amazon had some big news, very focused on tech. They had their interactive pause ads, shoppable live event overlays, and then a lot of updates to their DSP. And they were touting the fact that they now have access to 300 million US users across all the different properties. And for those who have not been paying attention, they've been adding additional properties, both between their owned and operated, Twitch, for example, but also they've been continuing to beef up additional content within the DSP with a big focus on CTV. And it seems like it's their goal to really become, rival the Trade Desk and become one of the main DSPs that's being used today, not just for their own inventory. Very interesting there.
But you got also you can't go without saying that Amazon is making a huge play in the live television sports world, right? In terms of Thursday night, yeah, and so is Apple. So that's a big play for sure.
Yep, and then WBD, they had their Neo ad platform, Storyverse program. And the goal of this was to let brands use their kind of historic IP to create custom spots. So I think that was kind of a cool feature they rolled out. And last but not least here, Google during the new fronts. And I thought this is interesting because they announced that they're going to be piping the retailer network data directly into DV360, their DSP. And this would be for YouTube campaigns. This kind of shows like this ongoing kind of merger, like between like retail media and what's going on CTV. I think the combination of that's really powerful. Google's smart to get on board. They've got, they've had it's been an interesting few months for them, but they continue to roll out new features, and they're going to remain a dominant player.
Yeah, and as long as they can connect that retail data to the point of sale, I mean that's kind of the golden goose for retail media, as they call it, right?
And that's why Amazon's was one of the big reasons they've done so well, right? Is
they can claim attribution at a level of accuracy that I think previously was sort of educated guessing, with some algorithmic logic behind it. But I think you're getting a little bit closer to proving outcomes.
Yeah, closed loop, and then you adding their emphasis on CAPI. They've been pushing out conversion API. I think it's not surprising. But then the backdrop for this, as we talked about before, is the layoffs, right? You mentioned a couple, Brett, but I think the Group M, WPP, Media. They announced, I think, 40 to 45%, right? Could be, they didn't say eliminated, or they just said impact in some way, whether that's new jobs or roles being eliminated. Those are big numbers, right? That's a big company.
And Rhea, do you think this was an inevitability that it ties to the WPP Group M business model, the agency holdco business model, or do you think it's something else that's driving?
Well, it could be that. I mean, I think there's always been questions over the years. Okay, these holdcos, they're a combination of many different agencies, almost seem federated, right? They all have their own CEOs, they all have their own trafficking teams, they don't even have common technology platforms a lot of times, right? That's starting to change. Like, does this environment accelerate that change, right? As they find efficiencies or optimizations across the whole co. I mean, there's probably tons of room for improvement, right? I mean, you look at how much duplication of different roles there are. So my guess is it accelerates it, Brett. I think a lot of them probably want to do it, and maybe this pushes them to do it. And maybe how much is AI driven, right? I mean,
yeah, and the economic uncertainty is certainly a forcing function, back to what we were talking about a bit earlier, right? In terms of, one of my old colleagues, a guy named Eugene Becker, who was from Exalate, him and I went through the Nielsen acquisition. He became the EVP of Data and Analytics at Axiom. He put a post up on LinkedIn that I thought was super interesting. I'll just read it word for word. It's crazy that the existing model with multiple agency brands duplicating effort has persisted as it has in a mature sector. Is there any other business that does this? At some point, agency holdcos need to be simply companies. And I thought you couldn't have said it better. Rhea, you and I were talking about it beforehand, about what that means when you talk about them being simply companies, and you had some good thoughts on that.
Well, I think that was part of the Val prop historically of the holdcos is we have all these different agencies that have their own flavors, their own specialties, and we can bring this to bear, right? We have great creative shops, great media shops, great analytics shops, and they're all a little different. And they'll run differently. I think that was always the Val prop, but moving into this modern era, I mean, is it does that hold water anymore? Are you better off saying, we've built a common data platform, we've built a common let's say activation platform. We've built, we've common processes for trafficking media, for everything. Hey, brand, we're going to be able to do this more efficiently for you. I mean, I think we're going to be seeing more of that. And even you look at some of the big indies, right? Like Horizon Media, Stagwell, they've grown a lot. I mean, I think Horizon was like over $9 billion in managed media. I think Stagwell is over 5, right? They're as big, approaching holdco size, right? Which is kind of interesting. And they've done this, but they made acquisitions, sure, but I think they're going to market a little differently. So will we see the big holdcos take that approach? I mean, I think what you're seeing with Group M, WPP Media, I think it signals maybe that's the direction they're going in, right?
Which is the Simply company, right? Where you've got EBITDA and you've got efficiency built in. There's not overlapping or redundant functions. Yep. Horizon probably is taking that direction, arguably.
I think Dentsu announced $2.2 billion in plan optimizations, TBD what that looks like. And then, like, remember at the end of last year, Omnicom announced 3,000 roles are being impacted. And that's not what's going to happen with the IPG merger, right? I think those will probably be much bigger numbers. They haven't really announced those yet. But to your point, Brett, I mean, as the holdco evolves, I think we're going to see more of it.
Yeah, and Dentsu talked about they talked about it as optimization in quotes, right? So what do you think they mean by that? Do you think that, in the topic of this podcast, when we get to our Ben Wilde interview, is certainly AI and the role that it plays in all of our lives?
Well, AI is probably behind some of it. You wonder, is AI the excuse, though? For sure, AI over time is going to change many jobs and eliminate some. And I think a lot, you hear what Brian Lesser, we talked about Group M, he said, human hands won't touch media planning in the future. May or may not be true. There was the quote about 25-year-olds won't be trafficking media in the future, right? I mean, it'll just be done by AI, but it's not happened yet, right? So I think AI is an excuse to make these reductions, right? That maybe are needed anyway, maybe not, but I think it's an excuse. But over time, I think as AI does get implemented, it won't just be an excuse, it'll be the reality that these jobs have changed.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, and the U.S. advertising sector in general has seen a bunch of net job losses, right?
Yeah. It's interesting, too, though. I mean, I talked about the little list in that post I made about Possible about AI. I think that it's just starting to impact advertising and marketing. It's wild. You look at tech, everything in tech is AI. I'm not saying it's suggesting everyone's vibe coding, but developers are using it constantly in their jobs. I'm not seeing the same penetration in marketing right now. People are using it for sure, but it's more they're using it for small things. I don't see it completely restructuring the approach to how they do their work now. I think that's going to change really quickly.
Yeah,
so
it's more supplemental, if anything.
Correct. Right. Yeah, it's like you have ChatGPT, or you have Perplexity, just running on your desktop, and I have a question for this. You use it to answer some questions. I don't see it fundamentally like restructuring how work is done yet, but that's going to come.
Well, with that, let's go to our interview with Ben, which was fascinating. And stay tuned, everybody. It's a terrific conversation.
Yeah, enjoy.
Hey, Ben, welcome to Signal and Noise. How are you today?
Good, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about agentic AI and the future of SaaS, a really great topic. I know you and Rio have chatted a bit, both at the Digital Velocity event from a company that you invest in, Telium. And had some real deep conversation about AI. Just for those that don't know, Georgian's a VC, right? That's the right way to put it. I think not a PE, but a VC.
Yeah, we're growth stage investors, so sort of
growth stage investors. Yeah, and and they invest in companies that do AI and automation and the like. And they put out a bunch of really interesting research that Ben was kind enough to share with us in advance of this podcast. One was your most recent report, the AI Landscape Series, Agentic Platforms and Applications, which you surveyed 600 executives, right? I think it was both across GTM as well as tech.
That's correct. Yeah, we put out a couple of things. One was it was a white paper, which was the AI applications and agentic software. And then we put out a piece of research with Newton X that interviewed 600 executives, 400 in what you call startups, and a couple of hundred in enterprises, and asked them a bunch of questions, which we can talk about today.
Yeah, and you got good perspective from both the GTM sort of marketing crowd plus the IT CIO crowd, which I think is a good balance between those two audiences. And then I thought your crawl, walk, run model was really interesting. Took a little bit of look at that. And then I looked at some of your past stuff, the AI Applied report from November of 2024. So we'll definitely dive into some of those details, a ton of really interesting findings that I'm sure everybody in the audience will be interested to hear and learn about. And some early conversations with Ben, I can tell you he knows more than just about anybody I've spoken to about this world, which is complex and there's a lot of acronyms. So I'm going to let Rio set the stage for the thesis of this particular conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. And Ben, great to see you again. The background here is, as Brett mentioned, Ben and I ran into each other at Digital Velocity. That's the TLM annual conference a couple of months ago. Had just great conversations, and I've continued to have them ever since and done a lot of thinking. And it's just such a cool topic. I mean, the premise here is, okay, we have this thing called AI. What's the impact going to be on software as a service, on the SaaS business, on not only how people are interacting with SaaS, but also on the business model itself? And you think about it, some people are starting to say, I mean, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with them, and that's one thing we'll dig into today, that AI, specifically agentic and generative AI, could potentially pose a mortal threat to the traditional SaaS business model because it does fundamentally change, or at least promise to change, the way users interact with software and how they derive value. I mean, you think about over millions of years of evolution, we evolved to interact with other humans, right? So if we can have agentic software that interacts with us with natural language and speech and things like this, maybe video, it's going to be a new way of interacting, and what this is going to impact everything, including SaaS, right? You think about it, traditional SaaS, buttons, knobs, controls, predefined user interfaces, workflows. That's just how it works, how it's evolved, right? And a lot of these SaaS companies charge based on features. You compare and contrast that to AI and AI agents, where they can dynamically execute tasks based on natural language. They can maybe even spin up UIs on the fly, just based on demand. It's pretty cool, right? Given this is where seems like we're going, why would anyone want to pay for 10 different SaaS tools, right? When, with complex UIs and all those buttons and knobs, right? Why would they do that when one single AI agent could, in theory, do it all, right? In SaaS, if you're paying for features, right, and if that's how the models work, why would you pay if you're paying for features, not outcomes? And AI could potentially enable tasks or outcome-based computing. Let's say you talk to the agent, you say, run a campaign, generate a report, build a journey for me. I mean, it's going to execute all those things. This, in theory, reduces the need to log in and manually operate individual SaaS platforms, right? So that is just a threat to the business model. Could be, right? And this really all begs the question, given this future that we all are starting to believe is there, is the SaaS business model potentially in jeopardy? Again, Ben, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here, Head of Innovation at Georgian. And we can kick things off. Love to hear a little bit about your background, a little bit about what Georgian does. The floor is yours, Ben.
Thanks, Ria. Appreciate it. Yeah, and I've enjoyed our conversation so far, and this should be another good one. Yeah, so Georgian's growth stage investors, as we said, and we're focused on B2B SaaS, enterprise software, and a few infrastructure investments as well. So a little bit of hardware here and there. But the common theme about everything that we do is really around the use of data in a trustworthy way, and in particular around AI use cases. So a lot of AI investing. I've been with the fund since Fund 1. We started out in 2008, and we're deploying out of our sixth growth fund at the moment. And we predominantly invest in the US, Canada, Israel, and the UK at the moment. And then, my role in the organization is head of innovation. It's a bit of a nebulous term, but what that really means is I work really closely with our portfolio. Spend a lot of time on product strategy around AI and agentic AI. I also support the pipeline activity, and I do, thought leadership. I get out there and I talk about this stuff as well. My background, prior to getting into investing at Georgian, was in the software industry. I was just prior to Georgian at IBM in its software group division. After being acquired in the early 2000s, I used to previously worked at Informix in the database management system. business. So, competing with Oracle and DB2 and Microsoft back in the day. So a lot of background in systems and being a DBA before that, and data management, and then just sort of naturally evolved through the years into the data science, ML, AI side, but always with a very applied perspective, and always kind of coming at it from the product management side of things.
So the innovation title lives up to the hype. I mean, you were an operator that was on the product side, was on the systems development side, right? You ran teams that did this sort of stuff. So
yeah.
Maybe it's not as nebulous as you think.
Well, it's a lot of fun, that's for sure. And then we'll just get to the really fun part, which is the disclaimer. And I just always have to say this, which is, I do work for an investment firm, but nothing I say should be taken as investment, tax, or legal advice. In fact, sometimes you probably do well just not to listen to a lot of what I say at all. Take everything with a healthy dose of skepticism, and I think it will actually make the conversation better anyway. So
this is purely speculative.
Purely speculative.
Purely speculative.
Yeah, exactly.
And just for our audience, don't call him an Aussie. He'll get very offended. For any of those that can't tell the difference between the Kiwi and the Aussie accents, it's kind of like Toronto and New York or Toronto and Boston. Sometimes hard to tell. You're in Toronto, right?
Yeah, we are based in Toronto. Yeah, it's correct. But,
and I find that hard sometimes to tell the difference, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to listen carefully and be like, there's certain words.
You do, eh?
Yeah, exactly. Let's dive into that report that you pinned or researched, and you're telling us about some of the deep learning algorithms that you run to pull a lot and source a lot of research with, which I thought was fascinating from a use case perspective, because we do a lot of that on our side. But it was the AI Landscape series. It's about agentic platforms and applications. What really motivated you to do this research, and can you sort of define, just set the stage of what is agentic AI in your mind, and what were some of the findings that were important?
Yeah, sure. I think the motivation really was to help just catalog some of what's happening at the moment. There's so much change that's going on in the industry in almost every aspect of software at the moment, both in terms of applications, but also in terms of the infrastructure, and also in terms of the underlying hardware as well. And it's more change than I've seen in the 30 years that I've been in technology. We were sort
it's hard
of
to make sense of it all, right?
Well, it is. And it's just, so part of it was just a bit of an exercise of cataloging, all the different areas that things are changing, and in part to help, explain some of this to our investors. We have investors in the fund, and then also to help us sort of give our perspective to the companies that we're either already working with because they're in the portfolio, or the companies that we'd like to work with because they're in the pipeline.
Yeah, we call those state of industry reports.
Yeah, exactly, that sort of thing. And it's been super helpful to go through and just for our own learning to dig in to areas that are familiar to us in terms of categories of software, but that are changing quite quickly. And as you mentioned, it's a little bit meta, but I'm using AI tools to do a lot of this, right? So I make heavy use of deep research style tools. One of our own companies, U.com, has their ARI deep research agent. We also use Gemini deep research, and I use OpenAI's deep research as well. I use all these tools sort of side by side, see how they all do, and they've been a really good productivity boost for me. And we can talk more about that. I think it's a good example of how, in fact, I'll talk about it now, which is like when you think about what an agent is, to me, the definition of an agent is really about it's a piece of autonomous software. It's able to perceive its environment, so it can get context from the environment. It can understand and pick apart what it's being asked to do. It can then do some amount of thinking, or what we call reasoning, about that task, or what it appears to be reasoning.
With some limitations, right? Yeah, that's a whole other topic. We'll get to that.
Exactly, with some limitations, and then sort of make decisions about what needs to be done. Maybe think about some subtasks, etc., and then do stuff. So use what we call tools, and analogous with tools in the real world, but use tools to get stuff done to achieve those goals, and doing all that without sort of constant human intervention. So just to give an example, through the years, if you go back to Google, when we just used to do Google searches, you're doing a search on Google, you put in a pretty short query, you get back a response in, something like less than a tenth of a second, and then it's over to you. Then you're reading through each link, and you typically don't go past the first page, but you read a few things, you click around, you read some more, and you might write it up. And so we saw that change, with the arrival of ChatGPT once it started being able to search the web. And so now you could put in a query in those, into something like ChatGPT or U.com or Perplexity, and it'll actually start to rewrite that query. It'll think about the query, it'll rewrite it. It'll then go and do a few different searches for you, and then it will come back with a more sophisticated answer, which is really a summary of what it thinks it's seen.
Yeah.
And that's going to take a few seconds.
Yeah. And I was pretty amazed by how quick Google adjusted their approach to search. With the advent of ChatGPT, because you were doing searches in Google that just weren't giving you the answers you were looking for. So I would go to ChatGPT, and I'm sure large numbers of advanced audience users were going to those types of platforms to get answers they wanted, because Google was just tons of results that required way too much effort for me to search through. It was a lot of retail stuff, right? So they adapted pretty quickly, and now it's kind of changed the nature of search.
Well, yeah. They're only really doing that for some of the ones they can't monetize. They have the search summaries, right? But then for the other ones they can monetize, they still have the ads. It's interesting.
I was just going to say, it's improved. Like, you can see the Gemini summaries improving. I think, in my view, that it's got better pretty quickly. But what I was going to say as well is but there's another step, Brett. Like, once you think about what I said about search, and then you've got head chatbots with these research agents. Now you're talking about, and this is what I'm using a lot in my own job, and so it's starting to automate what I used to have to do manually, which is, I'll give it a more detailed prompt. It could be, in some cases, I'm giving it a short paragraph of a prompt. And then it's coming back, these tools like RE or ChatGPT Deep Research will come back and ask you some clarifying questions. And then it'll go off and, I've run queries. It'll be, typical one will be 5 or 10 minutes. Some are 20. I've even had like a 40 minutes prompt run. And it, go away, and it's doing, I think qualitatively a much better job than, just when you just use something like a chatbot directly. And, that gets into this whole area, this notion that we can, improve the performance of these models by spending more time during inference. It's what they call test time compute, right? So just running the model, running more prompts against it, having it do more things.
It's optimizing based on its interaction with you.
Well, it's just, I think a way I would put it is it's spending more time on the task. And then it's, and it's also got access to it's able to go off and do more things like connect. If these research agents are going off and doing more searches, getting results back, reading it, and then thinking about that. And then they kind of go in these loops of, think, search, read, think, search, read, think, search, read. And they kind of do that a few times and then come back. And just, at least for me, qualitatively, that is starting to result in much better output. So it's pretty helpful.
Could you, just to set the stage before we go into some of the specific topics, could you define for the audience, we've talked a little bit about Agentic AI, you talked about how you've conducted research, right? LLMs to Agentic to AI to AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, which is hypothetical, I think, still at this point, and then artificial superintelligence, which is like Blade Runner, right? Which is ridiculously hypothetical at this point, but hypothetical might be 5 years away. Can you kind of define kind of the core terms that, you're going to be referencing and you think we should all understand at this point in AI's evolution?
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't want to sound dismissive of people's concerns or, optimism, depending on who you talk to about AGI, but I really don't spend a lot of time at all or any time talking about AGI and ASI, like this idea of superintelligence. The idea of AGI, of course, is that it's that AI would have a level of general intelligence similar to at the level of a human. But there's no agreement on what that means. There's no agreement as to whether getting to the similar outcome but using completely different methods and having no understanding of the underlying concepts, which is basically what language models do, right? They don't really understand the words they're spitting out per se, not in the same way that we do. is that, could you ever consider that? So there's all these definitional arguments that people are having. And so in my, I'm more interested in like, how do you build systems and how do we help our companies and how do we talk to new companies? How are they building systems that increase the level of automation because they've got these new technologies, and then deal with all the challenges that are still there? Because, if you've used these technologies, I think for me, the way what strikes me is that they're the most amazing tools one moment and the most frustrating and dumb the next.
That's what I was going to think. Yeah.
And a lot of what we're working on is like, well, how do you engineer products using these things? And everyone's working on this, right? And like some really big companies are struggling. I think it's Amazon. It's had a pretty, it's taken them a long time to try and get to the next version of Alexa. Integrating generative models and things, because it's hard, right? It's hard to make this stuff work consistently. And by the way, you referenced some of the research that we've done. Our most recent stuff that came out in the last couple of weeks around agentic adoption, pointed to the number one concern for both the R&D technical folks and the go-to-market folks in that survey of 600 people was reliability. So
trustworthiness of the results that it's spitting out, right?
Is it actually working? And so that's certainly front of mind. But the other interesting point I'll make quickly, and I'll let Rio jump in, is it's interesting to think about. The one thing I do find interesting is that my intelligence has been exceeded by the tools I use in a number of discrete areas, and that started happening in 1998. So if you're both old enough to remember when Google released in 1998, and you were probably like me, maybe you were using Alta Vista at the time, but most likely you were still using Yahoo's directory a lot, right? And that was a very manual, hunt and peck sort of approach to finding what you wanted on the internet. It's absurd to think of it now, but we used to use the directory. And immediately when Google came out, it was like magic. At least for me, and it completely exceeded my capabilities of search of finding things on the internet. So I, that's almost 30 years ago that my ability to research on the internet was, exceeded by a search engine. So
yeah, it was exceeding like microfiche and phone books.
Yeah. The model pre-Alta Vista was more like a phone book putting online. You just had a list, a directory, right? And I think Google suddenly, they were able to, okay, there's a search engine, we can, there's a browser, we can display the results this way. It was the better way to display the results based on a new format. It just took us someone not long to invent it. I think it's just kind of like going into SaaS here, right? I mean, this is a new medium, right? There's going to be a new way of interaction. I think there's going to be we're still to think that the SaaS way of using tools is going to carry through. I think it won't. It's going to look different. So I think it's a good analogy you just brought up.
Yeah, let's come back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to say, and then if you fast forward, right, to these deep research agents, I would say we've got intelligence that exceeds my own ability, at least in a narrow task. And I think I heard someone talking about this the other day. It's like, if and when we ever achieve, or when we achieve AGI or whatever, could be in specific domains or tasks within domains. Like, coding is a good example where maybe it could happen sooner because we're having really good progress at the moment around using AI and coding tools. But this idea that we'll get sort of general, just across the board human capability, to me, I'm reasonably skeptical that happens in the near future. And I certainly, like, my own personal view is that I don't think we have all the invention and the technologies that we need today to do that. I think it's proving out that it's unlikely we can just scale what we have today in terms of like language models, for example, and get to this. I mean, even with, obviously we were scaling training and we've got amazing and continue to get good progress, right? But that sort of appears to be maybe topping out a little bit and then we're moving to this like running at test time compute, and that's really improving, as I said, the quality of how these things work. But it doesn't eliminate hallucinations. Like hallucinations, there's research that indicates that hallucinations are a feature, not a bug, of how these systems work. And so they're probably going to be with us. And so therefore, if you have that inherent unreliability built into the system, it's hard to see how we can have full automation.
Yeah. Is
Because,
that a data problem, or is that an algorithmic logic problem, or something
uh,
else?
I wouldn't couch myself as an expert on that. I'm an enthusiastic hobbyist, but my thesis would be that it's an architectural, so what you would probably put in the algorithmic category. That the nature of how we build these transformer-based models is that there's this inherent tendency towards some amount of hallucination. And as I said, some indications that it's part of the creativity. It's part of how we create things. And then you can get into a whole argument about, well, does it just need to be better than humans and like just a bit more reliable than giving the task to Rio? And it's like, well, if Rio makes a mistake, we're probably much more forgiving of Rio. When it comes to
Rio hallucinates all the time.
exactly, sometimes recreationally, I'm sure, but but
It depends on the day
the
of the
point
week.
is that
But,
in IT systems, and in IT systems, we have different expectations, right? And so again, this is coming out in the data, right? So people are like saying that reliability is we don't, is one of the main top, the top issues that people are dealing with here.
Ben, the number of hallucinations has gone down quite a bit, is my understanding. It's, it was really high when we first started this thing. It's, I think it's gone down to, I mean, I've seen studies where it's close to human error, right? And why couldn't we have a future where, I mean, we were, you wouldn't, in journalism or like if you're writing code, you wouldn't publish anything or push anything into production until it's been reviewed by other people, right? So, I mean, is it conceivable that we're going to have teams of agents supporting each other, looking for hallucinations, fact checking? Could we conceivably, once we gain that trust, get to a scenario where there's human in the loop almost all the time now? Is there a scenario in the future where we don't need that? I mean, I could see that potentially happening, and how quickly will it happen? Maybe a couple of years. I don't think it's further out than that.
Yeah, I'm probably a little bit more cautious on that. I think that there's been a lot of progress and experimentation with things like what's called LLM as a judge. So judging the output of one language model with another, and I think there's good work being done around that. But I don't think it's all the bullet. In fact, some research that I read showed that the larger the model, the more capable the model, the less good it was at detecting errors. And in fact, smaller models were better at detecting errors than larger models. There's all these sorts of intricacies that people have to work through. And, there is an inherent issue with using something that hallucinates to detect more hallucination. So I think what will happen is we will figure out what is an acceptable level of reliability. And I think we're still just finding our way there. Maybe it's not what we expect from a cloud system, like 5 nines of reliability, right? So maybe it's less than that. But it's I don't think it's 50%. Obviously, it should be better than the coin toss. And a lot of these models have got like a lot better. But if you look at some of the benchmarks and the error rates and things, they're achieving, a 90% score on the benchmark is pretty unusual, pretty high still. We're still seeing pretty big error rates in some things. And if you have error rates, 1, 2, 3% on each step in a process, and you've got dozens or hundreds or thousands of steps, the potential overall error rate of the system gets very large. So I think a lot of this stuff has to still be worked through, and we still have, and it will vary by industry, right? Rio, like some areas it doesn't matter. Like when I'm doing web research, if it hallucinates, I pick up on that really quickly because I can click through and I can see that the link doesn't exist. On the other hand, if
you can't tell necessarily by the nature of the answer in all cases. Yeah. It's more of the source of the answer that
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, exactly. But if there's other tasks where it's much more difficult, and then there's if you've got a regulated environment, it's more difficult again. Like I do a bit of work with one of our firms, which is WorkFusion. They're in the financial crimes and compliance space. So they provide agentic workflows for doing things like adverse media monitoring. So, checking articles online about people, KYC, AML screening, stuff like that. So that's a part that's very it's a regulated task, if you like, within a regulated industry. And it's quite high consequence. And so it's the idea that
can't get it wrong. Yeah.
Can't get it wrong. So the idea that you would leave that to chance and have a language model reason about it, that's not really what that industry is looking for, right? They're looking for use of AI to enable more, covering more edge cases, increase the level of automation. But there's well-defined set of steps that need to be followed. So don't necessarily, want the language model to spit out a different way of doing things each time. There needs to be a well-defined workflow. This is sort of actually gets into the definition of agency and agents. And my view on that is that it's a continuum rather than a black or white thing. So just because there are well-defined steps, or it's using pre-existing workflows or pre-existing tools or accessing a database, and it's not just trying to do everything on the fly, it doesn't mean it's not an agent, from my perspective.
It doesn't mean it's not an
That's
agent.
interesting.
Yeah.
You're just taking advantage of the automation capabilities, right?
Yeah.
To facilitate speed to completion of a task, to facilitate cost reduction, right? Which is obviously a concern with people in a lot of industries, that certain tasks, especially the repetitive tasks, are going to be replaced by agents, right? So what are the main drivers of why a financial services firm would use this? Is it cost reduction plus speed to answer? A combination of those things?
I think a combination of those things. Efficiency is one of them, but also just being able to also look across more information than was possible before. So that's where you get into this whole thing of, partly it's about displacing labor to some extent, but a lot of it's also about doing things that weren't economic to do before. I think an example I heard on a podcast the other day was the founder of Flexport talking about how they were starting to use voice agents to call all their truck drivers, and it wasn't economic to do before to ring a truck driver individually with a human to figure out what the capacity is when you're down to the level of literally the person that's sitting at the wheel. And so that's an example of where they're doing something that a human could do that just wasn't economic to do, so they can now do it at a much bigger scale. So there's a variety of different ways that people are using this. And it actually gets to, Rio, your question, if you want to go back into this now around, the future of SaaS. Is SaaS dead? And obviously this was kicked off at the end of last year a bit by the CEO of Microsoft. And he never actually said that SaaS was dead, but I think that was the headline that was put out. And the way that just to sort of throw it out there, the way I've been thinking about this is and talking about it with people is like, it's not so much, I don't view it that way. I view that my view of the future is that agentic capabilities will infuse themselves into most software, and in the enterprise space, probably almost everything will have some sort of agentic capabilities over the long run. Not today, but more and more as we go in the future. So if that's the future, how are the different ways that you can get there? And I think that existing SaaS applications are one of the ways that you get to agentic. Upstarts, net new agentic native companies are also there, and then there's whole new categories of software that are going to get created. Right? It's not just the cannibalization of SaaS at all. It's more like this revolution, and this new stuff that's coming along.
Yeah, Ben, one thing we've seen so far for sure is like these legacy SaaS platforms are embedding, let's say, agentic workflows at certain points. And I think it's been done really well. You look at Adobe, for example. I know Salesforce has been doing that. Some of the big legacy SaaS players, I think, have been doing a really good job. And I think adoption's been a little spotty, but it is a new kind of way of interacting, right? But I think the bigger question, though, is we know that's going to happen. There's going to be, let's say, audience builders, report generators, specific tasks within SaaS will become, let's say, more agentic. But looking at let's say the trend of composability, you combine that with agentic AI, right? Like if you think about composability and API first systems, right? That because AI agents can orchestrate calls across these multiple systems, right? And pull together data from different trigger actions and access tools just straight from the UIs, right? Are we going towards maybe a potentially completely new architecture, right? Where they're calling on, let's say, like Stripe or Slack or HubSpot, just hitting these APIs. I mean, it's very different. So you're still using the capabilities these SaaS platforms deliver, but you're using it in a totally different way where you're not actually accessing the SaaS platform, you're just actually accessing services within it. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I think that, as you alluded to, I don't think the SaaS applications, these systems, will go away. I think the nature of what they do changes slightly. We still need the databases, we still need the data storage, the data models. And I think in a lot of cases, we also need the well thought through, predefined workflows. I'm personally skeptical that you want an agent to figure out everything every time anew, right? So first of all, it's economically inefficient to, if for example, there's always the right 6 steps to take to solve a task, with a few exceptions, you probably want to try and follow those 6 steps. So this is the argument for, you might generate that code using an agent once and then test it, but it becomes then a tool that another agent can use to execute it. But you're not trying to recreate it every time.
Yeah.
So,
and it's the consistency of results and outputs that you want.
Exactly. So so you have these SaaS systems. To your point, you're maybe not hunting and clicking around as much in them. So there's potentially less of that busy work that happens. But you still need the system to be there. And then, yes, there is, obviously there's a lot of work at the moment around things like model context protocol. So that's MCP is a standard that was released latish last year by Anthropic. OpenAI have now said they're adopting it, and there's quite a lot of activity around implementing the standard. And really what it does is it allows you to expose software, so it could be a database, it could be an application, it could be another agent or language model, but it's a getting towards having a standardized way of presenting these things so they can be used by agents. And so you can do what you were talking about, Rio. You can start to compose these things together. But there's still an open question as to who you're going to go to get that, who's going to actually provide that agent that does this for you. And will it be an agent, a single agent, kind of like you were alluding to, that can access all these many, many different things? Or will it actually be a multitude of agents all cooperating with each other? So Google has released this other standard called A2A, so agent to agent. And so that pattern is more, you might have a bunch of specialist agents, and it's a way of having them talk to each other in a standardized way. So that's another way of looking at it. And the truth is probably in between, and you might end up, an A2A agent might use multiple tools and then talk to another agent that uses a one tool or whatever. So you probably compose these things together. But I think you'll find that there may be advantages to, going to your CRM vendor to use a CRM agent that's been, maybe they've got some sort of insight or particular data set they've been able to train that agent to be really reliable at those set of tasks. And then
it's specialized for that specifically type.
Specialized for that task.
For that SaaS, yeah.
Yeah. But
do you think it challenges the model, though? Go ahead.
Yeah, the pricing model, yes, I think. And the pricing model, I think, is challenged, right?
It challenges the pricing model of the CRM because you're leveraging is it a third-party CRM agent that would be doing tasks that the CRM can't achieve on its own? Is that?
Well, I think, Brett, it challenges the model, and this is, I think, Rio's point, more because it's less clear that it's a per seat.
Yeah.
It used to be easy. You used to run around. How many salespeople have you got? Well, we've got 100 salespeople, so we have to buy 100.
Yeah. So it challenges the per seat model, which not all software operates on a per seat model. MediaRater is an example of that. But that's an interesting point.
I think I don't think that's a fundamental problem. I think that's. It's going to happen. The per seat model, just like the FT model, like in agencies, is going to be severely challenged and probably go away. I think the per seat SaaS model gets severely challenged and potentially goes away. But we've been seeing it anyway, like to a more consumption model. Like a lot of CDPs switched to the Snowflake model anyway. So I think we're seeing constant evolution of how these things price themselves. So I think that's normal and okay.
Totally. Yeah, because the per seat model sort of it's really about usage and how often you're using the SaaS platform, right? And then your cost per action within the SaaS platform. And it's in aggregate, that's the most important number, whether per seat or not, right? So get people to use your software, whether it's through an agent or not, as much as possible, because you're going to drive down this sort of relative cost for the company that's paying for the software, right?
I think so. But one of the things to bear in mind is that just because some things we'll do less of in these applications, there might be other things that we do more of. And so as we move to this model of having more agents, say, running on top of the CRM, there's still work to be done. So if we go back to the discussion before about reliability, and in my view, we're still a few years at least, maybe more away from being fully at the point where you don't need a human in the loop. And so working from that assumption, you're still going to want to log into these SaaS systems. You're going to want to check the work of the agents, make sure things are done properly, validate things. You're going to need to log in to authorize certain work and all this sort of stuff. So there's still a supervisory role and a human reasoning, human interpretation role, because there's certain types of thinking that these models are not exhibiting, good skills in yet. Things that humans can do fairly easily that they struggle with.
And do you think that's a threat to sort of the hockey stick adoption growth that I'm sure some people are predicting out there in terms of how quickly this industry and these software providers are going to grow, right?
That's a great question. I would have to say I don't know. I think you should probably temper your expectations around the level of like how much what level of automation do you get to? So if the revenue hockey stick thing you're talking about is dependent on the idea that we can automate 100% of a particular task or a role, then I would say, yeah, I would temper those expectations. But I think the opportunity here is still super exciting because now we're able to do a lot more. Like if you look at someone like myself, I'm using these technologies as a force multiplier. So it's changing my role, but it's allowing me to do a lot more. But I'm still there, having to move the chess pieces of it.
Yeah, and on my team, on the B2B side, GTM side, it's definitely a force multiplier. But then you go to B2C, big brands where we were talking about this earlier, Rio, where they could force multiply a creative team, for example, that might have to do thousands of variations of personalized ads or whatever it might be, any size, shape, or form. To a force multiplier of 10x, 100x, right? No longer do you have to have people doing these things. You could do the work of 40 with a team of 4. Isn't that the argument behind a lot of this and a lot of the economic value that they're expecting from this?
Yeah, but I've seen we were talking about this earlier. Remember, like about a bunch of within marketers. I think in IT, like everyone's adopting it. Like every like CEO I talk to of a tech company, like all their engineers are using it. But I think marketing adoption is lower. So there's a question. Yeah, there's a question for you then. Like adoption, where is it? Like what's impeding it? Are humans the bottleneck? I kind of see them being, right. I think AI is better than most people know. It's more effective than most people are using it for sure. And whether we get to AGI or ASI at some point, it doesn't need to get there to be really useful. Like what are the bottlenecks for adoption and what kind of adoption? Where's it working? Where's it not?
Okay. That's a great point, Rio. But I think one of the reasons that it's being adopted quickly, and certainly areas like coding, is that while not perfect, coding is you can run the code, you can compile the code and see if it works, right? That doesn't tell you whether it's efficient. It doesn't necessarily tell you that there's whether or not there's security problems with it. But you can also verify the code using static analysis tools and things. There's ways of validating that what came out of the model was valid, was good, right? That's actually more difficult in other areas. So if the three of us would say, let's go write a white paper on a cancer drug that we have no understanding of, then our ability to evaluate what's coming out of the language model and to know whether it's correct or not is almost zero, right? And so if you're a marketing person, I'm not saying they have zero knowledge of the industries they're in, but if you're a marketing person, you're not a technical person, but you're in a software company and you're tasked with writing a blog piece, sure, you can use these technologies to produce that, but it's hard to you may not have the skills to be able to work out whether it's correct or not, and you've got to read through the whole thing. There isn't some compiler that you can run that through to tell you whether it's actually right or not. Now you can certainly use other language models to test things and things. There's tricks you can do and you can improve that, but that could be one of the reasons, Brett, that maybe in some fields like marketing there's maybe not quite as much adoption as others. There's sort of the garbage in, garbage out problem. You can't, it's hard to assess things in some cases.
Looking at agentic software, Ben, I mean, what agentic tools have you seen get? I mean, it's a term people throw around, right? So what like truly agentic tools have you seen that have been out there that are getting adoption, are getting tractions? Are these companies revenue positive? How can you comment on that?
Oh, it's hard for me to. I mean, I don't really have a lot of insight into private companies what they're doing from a revenue perspective. But there's certainly been, I think, in some areas talked about it a lot, but like around web research, there's been a lot of adoption of this technology. So the whole idea of putting a language model in front of a search engine or a search index, that's obviously been a use case which has been really well suited and got a lot of traction. It has, it's relatively low risk. Although, obviously there was a whole bunch of copyright issues and things around this which have bubbled up. But that's one area where there's been quite a bit of traction. And I think I can, probably best if I talk to what I see happening in our portfolio, where I see things working really well and, adding value and getting use is where the technology is being used in a relatively narrow task-specific way. So, helping augment something that was already happening in the software process, or where the language model can be used in a very specific way that can then be measured as to whether the result is correct or not. And the more open-ended the task is, the harder it is to provide a feature based on these technologies that's reliable, right? So the most success that we see is when you're sort of being incremental and you're building on it rather than sort of coming in with magical thinking and just having this sort of all-seeing, all-doing agent tries to take on a big complicated task.
Yeah, is that a little bit of what you guys have talked about with the crawl, walk, run approach to doing this, right? How do you get started? Whether you're in a CIO and running a tech organization, or you're a CMO and running a GTM or otherwise organization, what would your recommendations be for let's say, just think of larger organizations that are sophisticated, that have huge manpower, that are looking for efficiencies, they're looking for potentially cost savings or otherwise automation. How do they get started? What's the kind of framework to kind of get from A to B to C?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to pick up the tools and start using them, right? And not just don't just say, well, I've used ChatGPT or whatever once and then not go back to it for a while. I think it's been really effective for me is to reach for these technologies first. So obviously I'm a knowledge worker, so it makes sense. But I, even at home now, if I have something wrong with the washing machine, I'm on one of these language models trying to debug it. And so that shift in behavior to start to use these technologies first and think that way, so that they're starting to augment what you do, and then build on that and try things that you might not think will work, but see if they do, and you often be surprised. So by doing that, you're starting to prototype how these technologies can be used, and then then start to think about, well, do I want to take this further and build something focused around this? Like, can I get my tech team to actually build something out that does this kind of thing for our business, or look for a vendor who's thought more about it and maybe incorporating the technology into a wider package? And that's a big decision for a lot of people, right? It's like the whole build versus buy thing. That's a challenge in itself. But it's like, get started, be incremental, and just experiment and move forward.
But we're thinking about what to build, Ben. I mean, I think it's interesting. So like a lot of the success I've seen so far is, you take the SaaS platform, you drop in an agent that does a specific task, which makes a lot of sense to me, right? It's not disrupting what's there. It's using the foundational like database and the models they have. And even, I think in a lot of cases, you almost have this agentic layer with like MCP hooks that kind of are twisting the knobs and controls in SaaS, right? So, and I get it. That's where we've seen success so far. But you almost as a counterfactual, you could argue, okay, well, but the true AI companies of the future, they're not going to try to like take the old index and just make it better. They're going to blow it away, right? They're going to say, forget it. We're going to rebuild this, re-architect this thing from the ground up. We're going to go completely AI native, right? And I think no one, as I mentioned earlier, no one really knows what this is going to look like. Is it going to be an iterative thing where you're like, hey, computer, you're talking to it, it's asking you questions back? Is it going to be, I mean, no one really knows. I wonder if have you thought about this? I'm sure you have, right? A little bit. I mean, I'd love to get your 2 cents on that.
Yeah. I think a lot of stuff does change, but I think a lot of things stay the same. I think, and we talked about it earlier, we need, where we're going to store the data. Are we going to completely abandon database management systems? Are we going to abandon network software, storage software? So there's so much. The answer is no, we're not. And there's so much that is underlying this, agentic capability that it needs to support it, right? So I think the things that are going to change and the more agentic native thinking um, is more on the and using these technologies to deal in more flexible ways with sort of situations that can't easily be figured out ahead of time, right? But my personal view is that it's more iterative, and this is more like a new technology wave than it is a completely like discontinuity. I
Yeah,
think when
that's
we
a good
look
point.
back at this in hindsight, it's going to look, it's probably going to look more like the shift to cloud than it is the invention of fire. Like it's like there's a lot of hyperbole around it, but it's likely more just to evolve software than it is to completely replace it. And I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and it was from the CTO of one of these agentic memory companies, and she made the point that like it seems that everyone that's building agents has forgotten about databases, and suddenly started like everything's
That's
like
funny.
written in JSON, and then we're just going to persist it out to persist it to a file, and it's like stuff that makes no sense at all. So
Well, does
the
that
way
does that make no sense though? I mean, isn't that kind of fulfilling the promise of interoperability, which Martech and AdTech and the data space has been talking about that for a decade? Like data interoperability, then came APIs, but doesn't it help connect the dots between all of these systems and platforms?
I'm pretty confident, Brett, if you wrote out every piece of data to a JSON file and stuck it on the file system, you'll have a hard time finding anything over the long run.
Yeah.
Like, there's just indexes, query languages, like, there's this software is more like a lasagna than anything else, right? We have all this capability and we add more as we go. And I think that's a likely outcome here. I think, Rio, to your point, some parts of the stack will be completely reimagined, and there will be whole new categories of, in my view, of like human work that we can do now because we can use these thinking models, if you want to call them that, to just do things that just deterministic software just could never do, or even classical AI couldn't do. But the idea that everything just disappears, I don't buy that.
It's funny when the AI thing first started 2 or 3 years ago, a client asked me, "Oh, okay, AI. Does this mean I don't need a DAM anymore? Can I just throw my images somewhere and have an AI rip through it and tag it and put metadata on it and fetch it whenever I need it?" And my answer at the time was, no, you still need it. You still need an underlying taxonomy. And there's been a big movement recently. Maybe we don't need taxonomies anymore. Maybe AI can immediately go in, analyze things, tags them, and it offers the promise of that. But I think we're far off from that. And I think for now, AIs can tag things better, look at them quicker. But I still think you need the underlying superstructure. I'm agreeing with what you said, Ben.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Rio. I think that, to the point about the digital asset management system, like the nature of it might change. So maybe you don't have a rigid taxonomy sitting in there, but you're still going to have security access controls. You're still going to have even the tagging service that you mentioned that might be provided by that system. You're certainly going to have like storage decisions about, especially if it's a distributed system, right? So it's not running in one place. So you've got a cluster of different storage. There's all these problems that still need to be solved. And we've got this new technology, this new capability to reason about, think about, plan even a little bit about what to do. It doesn't suddenly replace everything. What it does is open up potentially a lot of new interesting use cases. And I'm much more excited about the combination of these things together than I am concerned about these systems of record suddenly disappearing. In some cases, maybe there will be more disruption. Like one of our portfolio companies, Poly AI, is in the voice AI bucket, and there's going to be, I would expect, quite a bit of disruption there. That does back to your earlier question, Brett, about you were asking about areas where it was, or maybe it was you, Rio, you're asking about areas where there was adoption of these technologies. Certainly in call centers, there appears to be some, rapid adoption of these automation technologies.
No, that's for sure. We've all experienced that before, more times
Yeah.
than once, for quite a few years, in fact. I mean,
Yeah, but even with a agentic, upstart like Poly that's coming in with innovative technology around voice AI, they still have to plug into other things. They still have to, plug into the telephony system. They still have to be, there's still controls around it. Still has to access real time customer information to get context of the call and everything. So it's that's why it's sort of this whole sort of lasagna metaphor, which is it's more additive than it is destructive. And I think it's got time to play out. And I think Rio, you're probably right in some areas of the industry. There will be some lots of change, but I think overall, probably the biggest changes are more around the software models. And to your point, Brett, the level of interoperability might improve, and the things that we can do will expand. I think that's where the opportunity is the most.
And it seems to me like what's going to take the most time is the organizational change, the human change, which Rio mentioned, right? Because there has to be human oversight. You've talked about it in a couple of different flavors, right?
Yeah.
In terms of establishing frameworks, which there's been a relative lack of, right? But how do you see this playing out from an organizational perspective? Because generally, big human organizations take a long time to change, right? Whether it's the government, whether it's big Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, this seems to be moving at light years faster than how we, as people, can change. How do you see organizations sort of establishing frameworks to be able to organize and manage this stuff going forward to reap its benefits, I guess?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question. I think it probably varies by organization, by industry, by job role. It won't be evenly distributed. It'll be different in all cases, probably. I think that one of the discussions I've been hearing recently is perhaps one of the biggest shifts is that we all start to become managers of agents, right? And so
Prompt engineers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, certainly by the end of the day, when I'm sitting at my desk, I get up at the end of the day, I'll have half a dozen, deep research tools of various descriptions, open in my browser, and I'm constantly passing out work, evaluating it, interpreting it, merging it into something else. So, and that's a different workflow from what I was doing 2-3 years ago. So I think one of the changes we might see in organizations is that they start to train people to think more like this and have some of those sort of management skills so they can apply them to using these tools and treating these tools like employees a little bit. And so that'll be one change.
I bet I need to connect with you offline to see if you could help me do some of this simultaneous algorithms running or deep learning actions running, because it's super helpful. I mean, I do a lot of that state of the industry stuff for our board and for our and it's super helpful because there's so much information out there, and to be able to collect and collate and curate that stuff manually, it's like and I'm already starting to move towards leveraging AI for these purposes, but it seems like you've taken that to a whole nother level.
Well, and yeah, I mean, and there's other skills in there as well. Like, I mean, critical thinking is as important as ever, right? So, we shouldn't be using these tools blindly. So, I think there will be a lot of change. I think that'll probably organizational issues, liability, accountability will cause us to need to think carefully about how we apply these technologies, and it will, slow things down, and probably rightly so. So that's why when I step back and I look at this, I look at the technology, how amazing it is, but also, in my view, what some of the challenges are around reliability, and then I look at the organizational change. This feels like a kind of a big to me, but normal sort of technology shift. I'm much more in that camp than I am in the everything's changing. It's AGI in 2 years, and we're all going to be out of a
Yeah,
job.
and I
Like,
mean,
you know,
how much of that stuff was really, because I like this. This is practical. It's rational. It's incremental changes to our organizations, to the way that we do work, to the software that we leverage every day. But there's a lot of this fear mongering, right? Which I think some of it was politically driven. We won't go into those details. Where people jump right to Battlestar Galactica. They jump right to the human race is going to be exterminated and taken over by super intelligence that's going to force us off the planet, and then we're going to have to find our way back home. Why do we always jump to that part of the conversation?
yeah,
You're very practical and rational, and I think this is the way that we should be thinking about how it actually affects our daily lives.
yeah. There's much smarter people than me that do worry about these things, though. So, I think, in my view, I look at the technology and I don't see a pathway from what we have today to those fears, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have people thinking about that and debating it. But I just don't, I'm probably with you, Brett, is that in my view, it shouldn't overshadow either the application of the technology or even,
The
near-term
investment.
concern.
Yeah, the investment,
but
the innovation, all that.
and also we have, my personal view is we have to think, how do we roll this stuff out? And it's probably best we don't, we shouldn't have big discontinuities in terms of people's jobs and things. We should bring people along for that journey. I would think more about that and than I would worrying about super intelligence. But it's not to say that that shouldn't be a concern for some people. And it's just not my field. It's not my area. I don't, it's not anything I claim to.
Well, Ben, looking
expertise in.
looking at how it's being used by, let's say developers and even marketers today, right? Or business managers today, right? I mean, with a very small team with these tools, you can do a hell of a lot, right? I mean, let's say one junior designer who can now write copy. Brett and I were talking about a designer I know. He's now vibe coding tools, right? Instead of having engineers, right? So it's like smaller teams can do a lot more things with these. It's really accelerating work and it's making them more productive, but is it potentially like preventing them from hiring? It could be, right? So, I mean, I guess, but I'm a believer this is going to create more jobs than it's going to destroy in the short and the long term. I know people argue with me short term. That's not the case. What is your opinion on that? Do you think it will create more jobs than it eliminates?
That's a great question, Rio. I think it probably depends on the industry. At the moment, there does seem to be quite a bit of automation being done in call centers, and it's not necessarily true that's going to create a lot more jobs in call centers. But then if you look at, say, the creative side or like game development, there's a really interesting conversation between Tim Sweeney and Lex Friedman on the Lex podcast. So Tim's the founder of Epic Games, and he was sort of debating this with Lex and talking about it. And, Tim's perspective, and I think I would agree with it, is that rather than replacing creatives in the game or film industry, the nature of these technologies, it's much more likely that AI would be a force multiplier to work with a gaming or a movie engine rather than, replacing that whole thing. So it depends. I'm with you. I think, Rio, I think overall it'll create a lot of opportunity in categories. But, it could be that whole other categories do go. And so, again, it depends on, it won't be evenly distributed. But my personal view is that net positive overall. So, an example I give is that, if you look at midwifery, so as an industry, a number of years ago, my ex-partner, she was a midwife, and looked at we don't have any good software for managing, midwifery practices. Well, there's no money in it either. And so it's an example of an industry that would, benefit if the cost of development came down. And so you'd be able to potentially, to your point, vibe code, or at least produce, more efficiently solutions for whole categories of, economic activity that just weren't viable before. And so we could end up with more software, not less.
And that's an example of a relatively low tech industry where there is some benefit, which is interesting. right?
Yeah, and yeah, and there's a that I mean to go back to the question about where you're seeing growth and success. Like vibe coding is definitely one of them. There's a number of companies like Replit, Lovable who are getting pretty interesting traction at the moment. And then
Can you define that for the audience, just so we know what that means exactly?
so it's a bit of the vibe coding, or and I've also heard the term vibe marketing now. Is so with vibe coding, the idea is that you're not you're not a programmer, or you're at least you're not as accomplished programmer as what you're trying to create, right? And so you're using a language model or a reasoning model through prompts to create software, and then seeing if it runs, and when it fails, you go back to the thing and you cut and paste the error in, and you ask it what went wrong. And then there's tools that make that cycle a little bit more efficient. But you can just do this in something like ChatGPT if you want to. So that's kind of what vibe coding is like. You try something, see if it works.
It up levels your technical abilities if you're not quite there to facilitate.
And it's a fun way to learn. It's a fun way to build.
What I was getting at with the guy who's vibe coding, like he's a designer, right? So he's able now to be a great designer. Now, some of the design work he was billing for before, whether it's like production, resizing banners, changing things, that's gone, right? I mean, that's been taken by AI. But the thing is, he's able to be a much more productive designer because he's able to spend more time selling his work, dealing with clients, even creating apps without having to hire or pay for engineers, or not as much engineering. So it's really interesting. It's making him more productive. It's changing his role. I mean, if he thought he was going to just have a team of people doing production work, sitting in a studio, I mean, not really anymore. He might now have one person with a team with a bunch of LLMs doing the work for him. So I think the nature of the job has shifted. I think people just have to adjust. I mean, we've always been adjusting, right? We've been adjusting, forever, right? But I think it accelerates now. Ben, this was really awesome. It's great to hear your opinion. I think I can speak for both Brett and myself when we could say, we really appreciate you coming on here. A lot of stuff to think about. This is going to continue evolving. So maybe we can even do this again at some point. Later in the year, early next year. I'd love to kind of check in, see where things are. I know Georgian's going to continue to put out a really good thought leadership and reports as you work with different clients and kind of take the pulse of the industry.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. It's been a great discussion, and we'll talk again soon.